Muy buenos días a todos y todas, los colegas que nos acompañan. Bienvenidos todos al cuarto encuentro nacional de competencias de información con el tema Avalúo del aprendizaje, aplicaciones, instrumentos y prácticas en el desarrollo de las competencias de información. Mi nombre es José Sánchez Lugo, profesor de la Escuela Graduada de Ciencias y Tecnologías de la Información, y estaré sirviendo como moderador en la mañana de hoy. El Encuentro Nacional de Competencias de Información, que está en su cuarta edición, es una actividad bienal donde pretendemos acercar a profesionales de la información de diversos niveles académicos y escolares para dialogar e intercambiar información y experiencias relevantes a las competencias de información. Esta segunda jornada lleva por título Hablemos de avalúo, definición, aplicaciones y evidencia. Antes de iniciar las presentaciones, quiero solicitarles que por favor escriban sus preguntas en el chat. También habrá tiempo para preguntas al final de las presentaciones. Vamos a proveer un certificado de participación a esta actividad a quienes completen la evaluación que se proveerá más adelante. La hoja de evaluación estará disponible hasta 5 horas después de esta actividad. Y además le invitamos a suscribirse a nuestro canal en YouTube, COPDCIUPR. Hoy es la quinta y última actividad de la segunda jornada del cuarto encuentro nacional de competencias de información. Y vamos a disfrutar de la conferencia titulada Applying Critical Pedagogy in Designing and Evaluating Information Literacy Competencies. Nuestra ponente es la profesora Lettycia Terrones, Learning and Instruction Services Librarian at the University Library at Cal State University, Los Ángeles, California. Datos breves sobre ella. As Learning and Instructional Services Librarian at Cal State University, Los Angeles, she provides research guidance and library support for the brilliant students at Cal State. Additionally, she coordinates the University Library Instruction Program, where she works with the instructional librarians to foster pedagogical approaches to foster our students' critical thinking and knowledge construction. She is also currently working on a PhD in information science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and holds a Master of Library and Information Science degree from the University of California at Los Angeles at UCLA and an undergraduate degree in English from the University of California at Berkeley. Please welcome Professor Lettycia Terrones. Please proceed with your presentation. You will have 1 hour for it. Thank you, and let's share.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting this presentation today on applying critical pedagogy in designing and evaluating information literacy competencies as part of the Segunda Jornada Virtual a Cuarto Encuentro Nacional de Competencias de Información webinar series. I'm Lettycia Terrones, and I am the Learning and Instruction Services Librarian at California State University, Los Angeles. Before beginning my presentation today, I first want to acknowledge that I'm engaging this talk on the unceded lands of the Tongva Gabrielino Nation, who are the original peoples of the territories that surround the university where I work, Cal State LA. Our lives and intellectual inquiry as faculty at Cal State LA, a public university, are made possible because of the Tongva, to whom I would like to express my gratitude for protecting and taking care of this land, for fighting for the world and our subsistence on it, and for the enduring struggle and sacrifice they make and model to protect life, water, and land. I'm representing the University Library today in my role as Learning and Instruction Services Librarian. My presentation today will organize around the concept of situating, or in other words, locating specific contexts from which a person, an institution, and their respective actions emerge. I want to use this practice of situating to locate myself as a librarian at Cal State LA, a large public university in Los Angeles, California, that primarily serves Latinx students and students of color, most of whom are first generation and working class students. I build on this practice of situating in order to offer a perspective of seeing our students and to reconfigure how we might approach the teaching of information literacy and its assessments from a critical pedagogical lens. Considering how assessing information literacy is positioned most often as directed toward students, I want to ask what it would mean to switch that perspective around. That is, we usually assess our students' ability to read, engage, evaluate, use, create, and disseminate information. What I propose today is a refocusing of the lens to evaluate the critical perspectives of us, the assessor, in this case, librarians. Specifically, what would a critical pedagogical approach mean for our ways of reading the world? What would critical pedagogical approaches, those that usually come from critical ethnic studies, as ways of offering perspectives of knowing, what would that offer to librarians tasked with creating information what would that offer librarians tasked with creating formative and summative tools that measure students' degrees of engagement with information? I hope after my presentation today, we'll have a chance for conversation and perhaps a discussion of the ways that libraries broadly sort of shape their pedagogical perspective and responsibilities to our students in ways that can impact their success and well-being. But before I begin the formal presentation, I want to situate myself. I'm showing here some family photographs as well as an archival photo of Cal State LA back in the 1970s, which was the time when my parents immigrated to Los Angeles from Zacatecas, Mexico. I do this to locate my investments, my obligations, and my accountability to the practice of pedagogy and the teaching of information literacy. I situate myself as the daughter of Rosario and Juventino Terrones, who together combined have 6 years of rural classroom education. I grew up in the historically working class, majority non-white neighborhood of Boyle Heights in East Los Angeles, which is one of the neighborhoods that connects to Cal State LA. And I attended California public schools, including Roosevelt High School, which is a primary feeder high school where students matriculate into Cal State LA. I also attended University of California, Berkeley, another public university in California, East Los Angeles College. I did some coursework for my teaching degree at Cal State LA and also at the University of California, Los Angeles. So all of these different educational sites that I've listed and that I have direct experience in as a student are all intrinsically connected to Cal State Los Angeles. As many California State University Los Angeles students, I too am a first-generation student. I'm a Chicana from a Mexican immigrant family who came without papers to the United States. And I understand my achievements in higher education as deeply non-individualistic and deeply tethered to my kin. Indeed, my parents' educational aspiration, their radical imagination for myself and for my 5 siblings, was forged in the fields, tilled and harvested by my father's bracero hands. Those educational aspirations were manifested in my mother's heart and mind during the many hours that she labored, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and caring for the children of her bosses. And like many working poor, my family moved often, and they rented exclusively in this East Side neighborhood of Boyle Heights, which is connected, like I said earlier, to Cal State LA. And from all of these different locations where we rented and moved, the prominent black and gold letters atop Simpson's Tower, which you see here, that spell Cal State LA, were a constant reminder, a visible marker to me and to my family, signifying to us that Cal State LA was indeed attainable. We belonged at Cal State LA, and Cal State LA remains material in my life and my educational journey, particularly now as I serve as a faculty librarian at this institution. And so I center myself in this way to emphasize the incalculable value that this university has and continues to have in shaping the many lives that comprise its thriving communities. I center in this way to illustrate my close affinity as well to our students and their lived experiences. So who are our students? This slide provides some of the more salient demographics that visually illustrate who attends Cal State LA. So you can see from the graphs that we are primarily Hispanic serving institution, an HSI, with a majority of Latinx students. We also have a large population of Asian American students. And one of the notes in the ethnicity and race demographics that I want to point to is the disparity in the numbers of Black and also American Indian or Native American and Indigenous students. Considering that Cal State Los Angeles is one of the primary universities that matriculate our high school students, which are comprised primarily of Latinx, Black, and students of color, I want to note that Cal State LA is really lacking in its ability to bring in students of color, particularly Black students and Native American Indigenous students. And that's something that lies at the responsibility of our university. Our primary students, or our students are primarily first generation. And while the numbers are growing in terms of students who have parents with some college and higher education attainment, we continue and historically remain as a first generation university. We also remain as a university that primarily has students who are eligible for financial aid and Pell Grant, which are California scholarships, financial aid scholarships or grants that are given to students with financial need. And one of the important distinguishing markers of our student demographic is that most of our students are juniors and seniors, which is an important note that I want to come back to at a further point in my presentation. We also have a primarily commuter-based student population that is enrolled full-time. So what that means is that most of our students are working students, full-time working students who commute and attend school and then also have their responsibilities at work. Let me return back to this slide very quickly before I segue. So I want to situate my conversation, keeping in mind the student demographics, to note the different interlocutors that I will note in this presentation. All of the interlocutors are contemporary Black, Chicanx, Latinx, and Indigenous educators in higher education. Okay, I want to start with James Baldwin, and I want to take a minute to read an excerpt from his classic essay titled A Talk to Teachers. And I want to read this before going into an analysis or a discussion of why I bring out this quote from A Talk to Teachers by James Baldwin. The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. The purpose of education, finally, is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say to himself, this is Black or this is white, to ask questions of the universe, and then learn to live with those questions, is the way he achieves his own identity. But no society is really anxious to have that kind of person around. What societies really ideally want is a citizenry which will simply obey the rules of society. If a society succeeds in this, that society is about to perish. The obligation of anyone who thinks of himself as responsible is to examine society and try to change it and to fight it at no matter what risk. This is the only hope society has. This is the only way societies change. I would teach him that he doesn't have to be bound by the expediencies of any given administration, any given policy, any given morality, that he has the right and the necessity to examine everything. First published in the Saturday Review in 1963, Baldwin's classic essay, A Talk to Teachers, confronts the epistemic violence of anti-Black racism in the American public school system, presenting a reckoning for the white publics, indeed the cultural and intellectual elites in charge of institutions of American education. Baldwin here describes the, quote, paradox of education, close quote. While the nation state's ideology might purport a universalized ideal of intellectual inquiry, indeed intellectual discovery, to use the word of empire, to ask, quote, questions of the universe and to determine one's own identity, the reality of normative standard American education for the Black student is one of control and capture. Quote, no society is really anxious to have that kind of person around. What society really ideally wants is a citizenry which will simply obey the rules of society, close quote, Baldwin writes. Baldwin then shifts to presenting before his readers a warning and an ethical charge, noting that if American education continues unchallenged in its anti-Black violence, its biopolitical management of Black students, then, quote, indeed, that society is about to perish. Baldwin's charge for the educator makes clear the obligations we have to fight against the inertia of anti-Black epistemic violence. Our charge as educators is to teach our students that they do not, quote, have to be bound by the expediencies of any given administration, any given policy, any given morality, and that they have the right and necessity to examine everything, which I think is very critical in terms of our topic of information literacy, its assessment and evaluation, particularly the note of examining everything and what that means for criticality. I want to put here in conversation Baldwin's pedagogical imperative with Dolores Delgado Bernal, who is actually a professor and chair of Chicanx and Latinx Studies at Cal State LA. And Dr. Bernal's theory and practice of cultural intuition, an excerpt of which I will read in a minute, seeks to locate the pedagogical imperative against anti-Black violence and its direct resonance with our students at Cal State Los Angeles, the students to whom I'm accountable. Again, I'm going to read a bit of this excerpt from Dolores Delgado Bernal. Though I used my experiential knowledge as a first-generation college student, my work experience as an elementary school teacher and community organizer, my cultural history and memory, and Chicana feminist writings to guide my methodology, I could not yet name all this as part of my epistemological perspective, or what I later called cultural intuition. I outlined a concept or conceptualization of cultural intuition and a Chicana feminist system of knowing that questions whose knowledge and realities are accepted as the foundation of knowledge, especially in the research process. I point to the power of disrupting epistemological boundaries and show how doing so opens up possibilities for how we conduct research and how we reconceptualize what it means to teach and to learn. I reflect on my own scholarly journey as well as on the feminista, methodological, and pedagogical interventions of other scholars. I argue that these interventions enact ruptures in normative ways of conducting research and teaching, ruptures that allow us to envision a decolonial futurity or a, quote, a world beyond the limits of the present. And here Bernal is quoting Mares. Bernal's research in Chicanx higher education centers Chicana feminist ways of knowing, those errant, wayward, unruly, to use the language of Professor Saidiya Hartman here, those critical ways of knowing which are often invisibilized in the academy. Bernal describes the ways in which the epistemological perspective of Chicanx students in higher education activates the criticality that Baldwin was describing in the quotes earlier from A Talk to Teachers. Chicanx, and I would add here Black and Indigenous and students of color, in navigating American school systems, deploy cultural intuition to critically examine and, quote, question the knowledge and realities that are accepted as foundation of knowledge, especially in the research process. Criticality and the power of disrupting epistemological boundaries, to quote again Bernal, reminds us is vital. Criticality, epistemic unruliness, opens up possibilities for how we conduct research and how we reconceptualize what it means to teach and learn, and gives us opportunities to rehearse and envision decolonial futurity, or a world beyond the limits of the present. And here, in noting decolonial futurity, I want to segue into another critical pedagogical framework that's positioned by Linda Tui Smith, who is an Indigenous scholar in higher education. These rehearsals, this criticality, this engagement, and risk-taking, as Linda Tui Smith reminds us, are the counter stories that likewise give shape to Native and Indigenous knowledge-making and theory that perpetuate, quote, across diverse Indigenous communities. And here's the quote that I'm pulling from her book, another classic book in pedagogy, Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples. And Smith writes, imperialism frames the Indigenous experience. It's part of our story, our version of modernity. It's part of our story, our version of modernity, writing about our experiences under imperialism and its more specific expression of colonialism has become a significant project of the Indigenous world. Decolonization is a process which engages with imperialism and colonialism at multiple levels. For researchers, one of those levels is concerned with having a more critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values which inform research practices. Belief in the ideal that benefiting mankind is indeed a primary outcome of scientific research is as much a reflection of ideology as it is of academic training. Indigenous peoples across the world have other stories to tell, which not only question the assumed nature of those ideals and the practices that they generate, but also serve to tell an alternative story, the history of Western research through the eyes of the colonized. These counter stories are powerful forms of resistance, which are repeated and shared across different Indigenous communities. As Smith notes, quote, imperialism frames the Indigenous experience, close quote, and is part of the material and otherwise reality of modernism and colonialism. If we as educators and as librarians are to take seriously our obligations to decolonial praxis, we must engage critically with how imperialism and colonialism have and continue to shape academic disciplines, research methods, how we conceptualize information literacy, and academic knowledge production. The imperative for researchers, as Smith writes, is to, quote, examine the underlying assumptions, the motivations and values which inform research practices, close quote, which colonial logics often hide and normalize. Indeed, criticality is vital. And in this section, I want to segue into Latinx scholars and particularly noting the ways that linguistic assets are framed, particularly in Latinx students and Indigenous students who speak multiple languages. So for anti-Blackness and other settler colonial logics, indeed are powerful and often corrupt our attempts to resist the epistemic violence of whiteness as the universalizing normative standard of American education. And we see this at times in asset-based interventions, which reproduce the devaluing of quote, unstandardized knowledge systems. Tara Yoso's framework of community cultural wealth, another sort of classic framework within critical race theory, equips us with asset-based analysis for describing and understanding Latinx linguistic richness. As educators, we must continue to question how we deploy decolonial interventions, such as Yoso's in our own research and writing and everyday pedagogy. But are we, as Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores here note, perpetuating the hegemony in the presumption of dominant knowledge systems through the lens of asset-based perspectives? So here again, I'm going to quote the excerpt that I'm citing from this essay by Rosa and Flores. By embracing Latinx students' cultural and linguistic practices only insofar as they contribute to the learning of, quote, academic language, asset-based pedagogies are often rooted in the notion that, quote, home languages and academic languages are empirically discrete categories rather than ideological constructions. These asset-based pedagogies are based on the presumption that students of color will become academically successful when they learn to produce the appropriate academic codes, such as academic languages. However, we demonstrate the ways that the linguistic practices of students of color are systematically misheard and devalued, regardless of the extent to which they might seem to correspond to standardized academic language. These mishearings and devaluations are linked to forms of linguistic profiling that people of color face when communicating in, quote, white public space. Building on these analysis of race and language, we suggest that perceptions of different populations' language use as academic or unacademic should be understood in relation to racial linguistic ideologies, which conflate certain racialized bodies with linguistic deficiencies unrelated to any objective linguistic practice, and highlight the ways in which culturally sustaining pedagogies can challenge the educational inequalities that these ideologies reproduce. Rosa and Flores theorized racial linguistic ideologies as the epistemic and discursive violences that quote, conflate certain racialized bodies within linguistic deficiencies unrelated to any objective linguistic practice, close quote. They remind us that so long as we conceptualize home languages such as Spanish and academic languages such as standardized academic English as empirically different and discrete categories rather than ideological constructions, and that we moreover measure our students against these misconceptions and racialized ideologies, we also perpetuate the devaluing of diasporic, indigenous, Black, and heterogeneous ways of knowing. So I want to segue here to a recent incident at Cal State LA, keeping in mind the different critical pedagogical frameworks that I attempted to formulate with those four pieces. I want to segue to describe a recent incident at Cal State LA that made Twitter headlines not too long ago. The case regards the alleged sharing of test answers among students who allegedly shared test questions and responses on a group chat. The conversation among our campus partners when this happened took a turn towards surveillance of students and the punishing of students for their alleged cheating. This practice made me consider what the implications are for information literacies. One of the tenets of which is to teach the evaluation of information in terms of its ethical use and the determination of its authority and credibility. And this visual shows some of the different topics, for instance, that subject librarians who teach course-specific information literacy workshops are charged with covering. You know, some of the diverse topics that kind of cross different disciplines where librarians are asked to teach information literacy as it regards, these various topics or disciplines. Keeping in mind from the previous critical pedagogical perspectives that seeing all knowledges and disciplines as concepts and concepts as being constructed, what does this say about the policing and surveilling of students as it relates to this particular incidence of alleged student teaching? I want to ask what it would mean to turn the question around and to ask what the educational system and its infrastructure more broadly produces to effect or construct the concept of cheating, and by extension, the punishment of cheaters. That is the criminalizing of our students at Cal State LA, which I'll remind you is a primarily Hispanic serving institution, an institution that serves a primarily first generation working class student population. And while the recent controversies at Cal State LA surrounding student academic integrity has received unflattering attention, the library has historically provided students with support in this area. Specifically at Cal State LA, we provide students with information literacy instruction on plagiarism, instruction on citational practices and styles in APA, MLA, Chicago, for instance. In addition to information literacy instruction to the ethical use of information, including copyright awareness, and our primary modes of instruction towards this has been face-to-face virtual teaching, synchronous and asynchronous modes, particularly in this last year and continuing now in this pandemic year. So our library instruction to support academic integrity and plagiarism awareness has grown out of our subject librarian liaison model for instruction, which is based off of the frameworks for information literacy for higher education developed by the Association of College and Research Libraries. The ACRL frameworks present benchmarks, and through course-specific workshops and embedded teaching, librarians provide information literacy across all subject areas, covering, in this specific example, the mechanics of citation per disciplinary field. So the library, in working towards, addressing the, our response to the situation at Cal State LA in regards to plagiarism and academic integrity, has identified the need to collaborate across units on campus, such as the Center for Academic Success and Advising, in order to amplify our students and faculty awareness of not only the teaching resources, but also our approaches to citational practices. So in our discussions around academic honesty and integrity and choices around plagiarism, many of our librarians in our conversations have noted the intersections between teaching the mechanics of citation and also writing. So what we often will do at Cal State Los Angeles is teach a lot towards the mechanics, but we tend to shy away from teaching how to apply the mechanics to actual writing and the writing choices or the choices that students make as they're articulating thoughts and making arguments in writing. And here is where, for instance, we are growing our collaborations at Cal State LA with the Center for Academic Success and its writing wing. And these collaborations have proven very fruitful, primarily in their relevance and accessibility to reach a wide range of students, because the Center for Academic Success has a reach towards students that we would not typically see or interact with in our course-specific instruction. I want to kind of bring in here one of the citational practices that is modeled by the Critical Ethnic Studies Association, and how these citational practices or models can inform our approaches towards criticality. So critical ethnic studies, the association poses a series of questions that I think are very critical in terms of information literacy. They ask us to, quote, consider what you might want to change about your academic citation practices. What do you choose to link and recirculate in your work? Who gets erased in citational practices, and who should we stop citing? And I think for us at Cal State LA, one of the challenges that we have with our students is that they approach the variety of topics, for instance, illustrated on this slide, as being topics that are already formed, topics that have a standard and sort of unchangeability to them. And our students, one of the things that I feel as librarians in information literacy, our charge is to have our students think about these different topics that they engage in terms of locating scientific articles, etc., as topics that are continuously in flux and in motion, and that they too are constructed ideologically, politically, and also economically. And so for our students, getting our students to disengage from aspiring to having a dominance of academic language as a sort of marker of their proficiency, and rather to have them understand that academic language, their ability to find, locate, use, disseminate information is a participatory practice, a practice that they too also build and engage in, I think is a way to have our students consider who they're citing and why they're citing, particular people. So this is sort of a similar slide, and I'm getting here to the end of my presentation. We know that at Cal State LA, we are effective in our information literacy instruction because comprehensive assessments that measure our students' ability to demonstrate standard information literacy skills, both at freshman and near graduation levels, demonstrates their achievement of the skills. And we primarily have used the SAILS information literacy assessment standardized test as a marker. And while these assessments might give confidence and data-driven evidence of our pedagogical effectiveness to equip our students with standards of information literacy, I want to weave in our opening discussion about our pedagogical imperatives to cultivate and sustain diasporic, Indigenous, Black, and heterogeneous ways of knowing that continue to be invisibilized and devalued in the academy. Information science as an interdisciplinary practice engages the social forces that inform all of these different disparate topics that are marked by these little icons. Information science informs and gives shape to information and information technologies. It examines how information and information technologies and their role in society and everyday life intersect with power, authority, and control. Information literacy as a skill and pedagogical practice fits within the larger field of information science, particularly in the professionalizing arm of librarianship. Which leads me to a question about the future of information science and information literacy as student-facing and critical pedagogy, not only at Cal State LA, but broadly at all of the universities where we teach information literacy. As we envision it at Cal State LA, the study of information science will provide a practical and also theoretical grounding in the broader fields of archives, librarianship, digital scholarship, and cultural heritage, and help students cultivate critical thinking skills alongside the necessary training for further study at the graduate level and to prepare students for professional work in cultural heritage institutions. So some of the work that we're doing at Cal State LA is not only the traditional information literacy instruction, but we're also working to build libraries, information science specific courses through credit-bearing courses where we're having students engage in these broader considerations of power, authority, and control as it pertains to the creation of information, the concept of what is information, its dissemination, and also emphasizing our students' use of it in order to create a possible pipeline for our students to matriculate into master's level MLIS programs and archive programs. So one of the things that we're working on at Cal State LA is a launch of undergraduate programs in information sciences, which is seeing a trend across the United States. The launch of undergraduate programs in information sciences broadly evidences the value of this interdisciplinary degree, particularly as information science positions students for broad career and professional opportunities. Cal State LA's renown for upward mobility aligns with this vision of providing students with multidimensional tools to face the 21st century and to establish critical perspectives in the field of information technologies that they can apply to a cross-section of disciplines and not only to a cross-section of disciplines, but also work settings. And at the heart of this sort of planning that we're doing in terms of an undergraduate program in information science at Cal State LA lies a critical ethnic studies perspective, a critical pedagogical perspective that positions this diverse and also heterogeneous ways of seeing as a type of literacy. So critical ethnic studies as a type of literacy or way of reading the world in terms of understanding what are the underlying systems, ideological and also material, that shape our everyday lives. And so these are some of the things that we're working towards at Cal State Los Angeles. And I think that brings me to the conclusion of my presentation today. So here is my, my contact information. You can reach me at lterron@calstatela.edu. And I think I will leave it here. So go ahead and unmute. Or sorry, I'll go ahead and mute and send it to the conference organizers.
Agradecemos a la colega Terrones su presentación, muy interesante, muy provocadora, podríamos llamarlo, en términos de las tradiciones que nosotros, con las que trabajamos en el mundo de la ciencia de la información y la bibliotecología. El concepto particularmente de intuición cultural, el cultural intuition, como contrapeso a la epistemología. Estamos de vuelta. Ok. Excúseme, profesora Terrones. Parece que se fue la volvemos acá. Voy a activar la cámara para ahorrarnos bandwidth. Le decía que el asunto para hacerlo rápido y que usted pueda responder independientemente de que se me vuelva a caer a mí la conexión. A mí me parece un concepto muy interesante el de intuición cultural, porque las historias personales y colectivas de nuestros colegas y de nuestros estudiantes representan una riqueza muy importante, sobre todo en el desarrollo de una concepción de qué es información, qué constituye información, pero más aún, qué constituye conocimiento. Y conocimiento siempre tiene el apellido de válido o no válido, o científico o no científico. Y entonces sabemos que hay unas estándares, o que hay unas valores reconocidos en todas las disciplinas que privilegian unos saberes sobre otros, dentro y a través de las disciplinas. Entonces, mi pregunta un poco va en el sentido de cómo la experiencia de ustedes con este término acuñado de cultural intuitions choca cuando se está llevando a cabo un proceso, digamos, de desarrollo de competencias de información.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lugo. Muchas gracias por esa pregunta. Si me permite responder en inglés.
Claro, por supuesto.
Okay, sí. Okay, so I think this is why the perspectives of critical ethnic studies is so important as another participatory sort of lens, or another way of understanding and seeing the world. So I think, I think a lot about the word literacy, which, for instance, in terms of information literacy, purports a set of skills, dispositions, to use the language of the ACRL frameworks, that say, for instance, if our students are able to do, these skills, if they're able to demonstrate these dispositions, then they have achieved, a certain literacy. I think that sort of framing of achievement is continuously held in terms of a standard of like academic sorts of achievements, which our students are often, particularly students like we have at Cal State LA, are seen as having to measure up or reach, when in fact, the work of, for instance, Dolores Delgado Bernal, researches and rights, our students already have forms of knowledge. Our students already create information. They already deploy ways of reading the world. And so I think the flip has to be in terms of the way that librarians and also, library information science as a discipline needs to be shaken up, and the sort of standards that we hold in terms of this is what our students, need, those sorts of assumptions need to be shaken up by the ways of understanding the world that a critical ethnic studies perspective brings. And that we need to shake up, our assumptions that if, we, equip our students with, X thing, then they're going to be able to dominate or, navigate information. I think for me as a librarian, the key is the key lies in changing our students' perspective as well. Because many of our students come with these assumptions that, okay, I don't have this sort of skill and I need to have this skill, which is true, a bit, and I sort of think that our students, because of the ways that American standard public education is set up, have been sort of like inculcated with this idea that they're lacking or that they're deficient. But I kind of want to challenge our students and particularly our librarians to reconceptualize that and to get ourselves to think about academic skills are just another set of knowledge formation, another set of different applications that then students can have an agency in terms of deciding how they want to apply and use these skills. So, for instance, in this incident that I described about academic integrity and plagiarism, one of our students or our university newspaper reported different students talking about the incident. And one of them that stood out to me was a student that said, I'm not going to pay $8,000 of registration every, semester in order to fail a class. And so, our students are already navigating, a variety of technologies. In this situation, it was a group text sort of technology in order to disseminate and share information. And so our charge, I think, as librarians, is not to say that's not information or that's the wrong type of information to be sharing, but to equip our students with an understanding of what sorts of choices they have in terms of using that information. And so, so I don't know if that gets kind of to the question about, the construction of knowledge and the construction of value. I think that our universities are very much perpetuating these constructions of knowledge and value as, in ways that criminalize our students and sort of police and surveil them. Rather than thinking about, what is the system of education that we have that creates a situation where students would want to share, particularly in a pandemic year.
Yes, thank you, Professor Terrones. Another short question that I would like to address to you is regarding the application of the ACRL frameworks, and if you see some sort of not problem but conflict in as we interpret those frameworks and how they apply to the colonized world. Being from Puerto Rico, then we develop a way of thinking that it doesn't escape. It's very difficult to escape our colonial framework because it's where we live in, and we are all the time focusing in how the national, as we understand Puerto Rico as a nation, deals with some issue of knowledge, of information, or technologies and in ways that might not be the expected or that might not be defined as valid by some other collective. Do you see any conflict in that application of the frameworks within higher education?
Well, I think that there definitely are conflicts, because and I would include, just in my perspective, Cal State Los Angeles, for instance, but just broadly, the way that information literacy is sort of, disseminated and taught across the United States, as also being situated in a colonial context, And I think really, even speaking more broadly, the American higher educational system, in terms of its formation of disciplines and sort of the disciplinary kinds of investments that are held, all of that really is seeped in modernity. It's seeped in experiences of ongoing colonialism. And so then the work of Black, Indigenous, and Caribbean, other people of color, like all of the people that are working towards decolonial praxis, across, transdisciplinary, becomes very important in informing the way that ACRL can also think about the ways that it has, the way that it constructs what is information literacy, particularly because information science, library information science, remains a very white institution. I don't have the numbers, at the top of my head, but the primary the primary population of librarians, academic librarians, remains white, including at Cal State LA, which is a university of primarily Latinx and students of color. So I think one of the things that I want to say about the frameworks is that, I believe that the work to change the standards into what we now have, the frameworks, started in, I want to say, like the early 2010s, around there. And then I believe they were officially adopted in 2016. And so I always wonder, sort of back to the question about situating, who was part of that conversation? Who's part of, like, who are the people and what are their how do they situate politically and pedagogically? Who are the people that comprise the committees that create the frameworks that, we then adopt as a organization, as a professional association, and then use in order to build the actual lessons and sorts of practices that we use on a day-to-day basis. Are they bringing perspectives from Black, Indigenous, Latinx, perspectives of like decolonial, anti-imperial perspectives? I'm not really sure. I don't know, who the people were, but I know that the people that they are citing, so back to the question about citational practices as offered by the Critical Ethnic Studies Association, the practice of citation is very important. So I don't think that the ACRL frameworks are citing any decolonial, anti-colonial scholars. And so here's again where that sort of theoretical criticality becomes, I think, very important because it disseminates and it spreads to our day-to-day practices. So again, I think the important, for me, the important intervention that I can make on a day-to-day basis as a librarian is to continually engage not only my colleagues, my librarian colleagues, but also my students about shaking up assumptions of what we think is the truth, or shaking up assumptions about what we think is an unchanging way of being, an unchanging knowledge. We could see this all over the place in the sciences and social sciences. What are the assumptions that we're making that keep us from seeing how all of these sorts of knowledges are constructions? If we want to use some of the language of critical ethnic studies, what are the stories and also what are the counter stories that shape what we conceive of as, as knowledge. I was recently reading an article, it's an article related to some work that's being done in physics. So there's this huge machine, I don't know, it's called like the Hydron, oh my goodness, the name is escaping me, but there's a huge physics project that's, I believe, happening in Switzerland, where they have this machine that collides subatomic particles, and they've recently have found that the sort of standard theoretical physics kind of model is being challenged by some of the things that are occurring in the new experiments that they're making in terms of the ways that subatomic particles are reacting. So in other words, I think that that's sort of like a metaphor that illustrates, how these sorts of assumptions that we might have about what is science, for instance, that those also are up for change. Our knowledge is a continuous changing dynamic field. And rather than being sort of like frightened by the ungroundedness that might, propose, that we teach students that they can engage in this sort of dynamism and in fact contribute, to the growing and changing knowledges. And I think that that's where a lot of the sort of cultural intuition that many people who are impacted, really, all sort of subaltern people impacted in colonialism have a contribution, have a way, a mode of participating, because we live, all of us have to contend with, the impacts, ongoing impacts of colonialism and anti-Blackness. And at the same time, we also, create ways of being that that resist that sort of epistemological violence that it perpetuates.
Ok, gracias, muchas gracias, profesora Terrones, tanto por la respuesta a las preguntas como por la presentación. Me pareció muy provocativa y muy interesante para todos los asistentes. Que dicho sea de paso, quiero agradecer también a los participantes de esta actividad, desde la Universidad de Puerto Rico, en Ponce, en Mayagüez, en Utuado, en Carolina, en el recinto de Ciencias Médicas, colegas de la Universidad Central del Caribe, Escuela de Medicina, la Universidad Politécnica de Puerto Rico, la Universidad Interamericana, el National University College de Bayamón, colegas de Uruguay también se conectaron. Así que teníamos un grupo bastante diverso de colegas de distintas instituciones a los cuales les queremos agradecer y recordarles que por favor completen la evaluación que ya está colgada en el chat, para que entonces puedan recibir su certificado de participación. Una vez más, profesora Terrones, gracias por su participación, gracias por una excelente e inspiradora presentación, y dejo entonces a los organizadores para las acciones que entiendan pertinentes. Gracias a todos por su asistencia.